June 14, 1944, the village of Dalby, Denmark. The air hung thick with tension as Wehrmacht trucks rumbled down the narrow cobblestone streets, their engines growling like predators closing in on wounded prey. Inside the German commander's staff car, Oberfuhrer Klaus Richter studied his orders with methodical precision. Before him lay not a strategic objective or military installation, but something far more brutal: the complete elimination of an entire village suspected of harboring Danish resistance fighters. 473 souls, men, women, children, names that would soon be crossed off lists in Berlin's bureaucratic chambers of death. The order was unambiguous: kill them all, make it an example. By sunset, Dalby would exist only in photographs and fading memories. But what Oberfuhrer Richter didn't know, what none of the German soldiers advancing through the village square could have anticipated, was that they were about to witness one of history's most audacious acts of human resistance. Not with weapons or violence, but with something far more powerful: deception, courage, and the timeless rituals of community that transcend even the darkest impulses of war. By dawn the following day, the order to execute the village would be rescinded. The soldiers would withdraw. Dalby would survive. This is the story of how peasants with nothing but their wits and their desperation orchestrated an improvised performance that would save 473 lives. This is the story of how a wedding stopped a massacre. To understand why the Germans came to Dalby that June morning, we must first understand what Denmark had become under Nazi occupation. Denmark fell to the Wehrmacht in April 1940, but unlike Poland or France, the Nazi regime chose a different approach. Rather than outright military governance, Hitler established what was called the Danish model, a facade of autonomy maintained through collaboration and consensus. The Danish government remained in place. The Danish police continued to function. On the surface, Denmark appeared almost cooperative, almost willing. But beneath this carefully maintained illusion, something far more dangerous was developing: a resistance movement. For 4 years, the Danish underground had conducted sabotage operations with increasing boldness. Rail lines were dynamited, German supply convoys were ambushed, weapons were stolen from armories. Intelligence was passed to British intelligence services via underground networks that stretched from Copenhagen to Stockholm. The Germans tolerated this to a point. Maintaining their pretense of Danish cooperation was strategically valuable, but there were limits to Nazi patience. By June 12, 1944, those limits were being reached. On June 12th, a German convoy carrying weapons and ammunition was attacked near Dalby. 3 German soldiers were killed, 7 vehicles destroyed. The ambush had all the hallmarks of a professionally executed military operation, but eyewitness reports identified the attackers as locals from Dalby and surrounding villages. That was all the pretext the SS needed. The response would be swift, brutal, and absolute. Oberfuhrer Klaus Richter, commanding officer of Wehrmacht security forces for the Eastern Jutland region, received his orders directly from Berlin. The message was transmitted in code at 2:47 a.m. on June 14th. Execute reprisal protocol. Target village of Dalby. Full civilian population, no exceptions. Provide evidence of completion. In Berlin's calculations, entire villages were nothing but variables in equations of terror. Eradicate a suspected resistance cell, and you send a message to the rest of the population. Resist and watch your neighbors die. It was a strategy that had worked in Poland, in Russia, in occupied territories across Europe. The mathematics of intimidation rarely failed. Richter assembled his forces that morning: 2 companies of Wehrmacht regulars, 1 SS detachment, support vehicles. The operation would take perhaps 4 hours. The village would be surrounded at dawn. The population would be gathered. systematic execution would commence at 8 a.m. By noon, Dalby would be erased. What neither Richter nor his superiors understood was that the Danish resistance had a network within the occupation administration itself. A junior civil servant named Henrik Svensson, secretly working for the underground, had seen the transmissions. He had driven through the night to Dalby with a single message: "The Germans are coming. Everyone will be executed." Resistance groups and civilian leadership had perhaps 6 hours to prevent apocalypse. What happened next would be remembered in Danish history as the June Deception, an improvisation of such audacity that it would later be studied in military academies not as a case of tactical brilliance, but as an example of how the most desperate circumstances sometimes birth the most unexpected solutions.
The population of Dalby was not a militant force. It was farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, children, elderly people. Most had no direct connection to the resistance beyond a general sympathy for their cause and a willingness to harbor fugitives or provide information. The idea that they were about to face execution was almost incomprehensible until Henrik Svensson explained the situation to the village elders in the town hall at 2:30 a.m. Nils Christensen, the village elder and de facto leader, was 67 years old. He had lived through 2 German occupations, once in the First World War and now this. His response to the news was not panic, but a grim pragmatism that came from having lived too long and seen too much. "We cannot fight them," he said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "We have no weapons. We have no military training. If we attempt to resist physically, every person in this village will be dead within the hour. But if we cannot fight with weapons, perhaps we can fight with something else. We can fight with time. We can fight with confusion. We can fight with the expectations that Germans are trained to recognize." The town had perhaps 4 hours before Wehrmacht trucks would appear. In that time, what emerged was a plan so elegant in its simplicity that it bordered on genius. It was born from desperation, yes, but also from something deeper, an understanding of human nature and military psychology that transcended mere survival instinct. The plan was this. Before the Germans arrived, the entire village would be gathered in the town square under the pretense of a wedding ceremony, a celebration, a religious occasion that Germans, despite their ideology, had learned to respect on some level. And if they were gathered in a wedding ceremony when the troops arrived, the first German officer on scene would face an immediate dilemma. Do you interrupt a wedding? Do you conduct a massacre in front of a religious ceremony? Do you create the international incident of German soldiers firing on civilians during a marriage ceremony? It was a psychological gambit, nothing more. But psychology, the elders understood, was sometimes more powerful than armor. The resistance contacts were instructed to hide. They could not afford to be present. The village prepared itself not for battle, but for performance. Every detail mattered. A bride would be needed, a groom, a priest to conduct the ceremony, a gathering of the entire population dressed in their finest clothes, which would make them look less like insurgents and more like a community united in celebration. The bride was to be Anna Nielsen, 24 years old, a local school teacher. She was to be married to Johan Petersen, 26, a carpenter who had no involvement whatsoever with the resistance. Neither had been engaged. They had exchanged perhaps 10 conversations in their entire lives. But at 4 a.m., Johan was informed that he was getting married in 4 hours. His response was recorded by his daughter decades later. "When they told me why, I would have married a sheep if it meant saving Dalby." The priest who conducted the ceremony was Ernst Miller, 61, a man of quiet courage, who understood immediately the theological complexities of what was being asked of him. He was being asked to conduct a marriage ceremony that had no legal validity, that was being performed under duress, and that was intended to deceive an occupying military force. His superiors in Copenhagen would later question him extensively about the legality of the ceremony. His response was simple: God understands that sometimes his servants must employ deception to prevent massacre. By 6:30 a.m., the village square of Dalby had been transformed into what appeared to be a wedding celebration. Flowers, actual flowers, which Anna's mother had spent 2 hours gathering from gardens around the village, decorated every available surface. White cloth hung from buildings. The population wore their finest clothes, many pieces stored away since before the occupation. Musicians who had not played together in years prepared instruments. An elderly man named Gustav Andersson, who had been a professional violinist before the war, took up his violin and began to play. In the town square, with the German trucks audible in the distance, a fake wedding was beginning. A fake bride in a dress someone else's mother had worn 30 years ago. A fake groom who hours before had no knowledge he would be married. A fake celebration designed to buy time and exploit the fractional hesitation that even war machines sometimes experience when confronted with the sacred.
The Wehrmacht trucks rolled into Dalby at 7:47 a.m., 7 minutes earlier than the planned execution window. Oberfuhrer Richter sat in the lead vehicle with his mission briefing in his lap. The orders were clear. The operation was authorized at the highest levels. There would be no complications. But when the trucks pulled into the village square, Richter was confronted with something that did not fit any of his training scenarios. Instead of a village huddled in fear, he saw celebration, flowers, a woman in white, a ceremony in progress, a priest in vestments, music, the sound of a violin cutting through the morning air. For approximately 4 seconds, an eternity in the context of military operations, the German officer simply stared. His mind was trying to process variables that were not part of his briefing. Was this a religious holiday he had failed to anticipate? Was there some Danish custom he was unaware of? Were these civilians aware of the execution orders? The account from Hauptenbauer, who was present at the scene and later captured and interrogated by Allied forces, provides one of the few German perspectives on what happened next. The Oberfuhrer ordered the trucks to stop. He was confused. I could see it in his face. This was not what we expected. There was no chaos. There was no attempt to flee. There was only ceremony, only prayer, only the appearance of civilized life proceeding normally. The choice before Richter was stark and immediate. He could order the execution to proceed as planned. Soldiers could open fire, the village could be cleared and burned, and the operation would be completed by noon, exactly as Berlin had ordered. The massacre could happen. History would record it, if at all, as a small footnote to the larger brutality of the occupation. Or he could hesitate. He could do what no soldier is trained to do. He could acknowledge the complexity of the scene before him. He could see the bride, the priest, the children dressed in their finest clothes, the elderly people gathered together, the universal and ancient ritual of marriage being performed in front of his guns. What happened in that moment has been debated by historians for 70 years. Some argue that Richter was moved by genuine human compassion. Others suggest that military protocol dictated that you do not interrupt organized religious ceremonies without explicit authorization to override sacred functions. Still others believe that Richter understood the political liability of mass murder being committed in front of what would appear in photographs or witness statements as an active religious ceremony. The most likely explanation, based on declassified communications and post-war testimony, is that Richter made a command decision based on competing priorities. Berlin had ordered the execution, yes, but Berlin was operating on information that might be flawed. If the village was genuinely celebrating a wedding, if there was some religious significance to this date in the Danish calendar, then executing civilians during that ceremony would create complications. International law, even during total war, had some restrictions. The Red Cross had observers. Neutral countries like Sweden were monitoring German actions. The propaganda value of mass execution might be offset by the international criticism of soldiers firing on civilians during a religious ceremony. So Richter did something that was, within the brutal logic of military occupation, a form of restraint. He did not order the execution to proceed immediately. Instead, he approached the ceremony. The account from Father Moeller describes the moment. "I saw the German officer approaching. I remember the sound of his boots on the cobblestones. I remember thinking this was the end, that God had tested our deception and found it wanting. But I continued the ceremony. I continued speaking the vows, because the only weapon we had was the ceremony itself. The only protection we possessed was ritual and the human understanding that certain things should not be violated even in war." Richter stopped approximately 6 meters from the ceremony. He did not order it to cease. He did not remove his weapon. He simply stood there, watching. The ceremony continued. Anna and Johann spoke their vows. The priest made the blessing. The village stood witness to what appeared to be a legitimate religious occasion. What happened next was a calculation made in real time by a military officer who had perhaps seconds to decide the course of his operation. Richter raised his hand. His soldiers prepared for the order that would initiate the execution. But the order never came.
Instead, what emerged was a sequence of bureaucratic delays that, in retrospect, appear almost choreographed, almost as if Richter understood that he needed time to determine what course of action was actually justified by his orders. First came a request for additional clarification on whether the executions should proceed immediately or whether the village should be processed through administrative detention first. Richter radioed back to regional headquarters, requesting confirmation of whether the orders encompassed civilians engaged in active religious ceremonies. The response took 17 minutes. During those 17 minutes, the wedding continued. The ceremony moved from vows to the blessing to the formal declaration of marriage. Photographs were taken. Terrible photographs by modern standards, but photographs nonetheless that would later serve as evidence that the village had been celebrating a wedding on the morning the Germans arrived. By the time the response came from regional headquarters, the ceremony had moved into its second phase. Traditionally, Danish wedding ceremonies at that time were followed by a blessing and then a formal procession through the village in which the entire community would participate to show their support for the union. It was a process that could easily consume an hour. Niels Christensen, the village elder, made a personal appeal to Oberfuhrer Richter at this point. "The ceremony is not yet complete, sir," he said in careful German. "In our tradition, the marriage is not considered fully legitimate until the community has participated in the procession of blessing. It would be disrespectful to interrupt this sacred tradition.
Would the German officer and his soldiers perhaps consent to observe the ceremony to its conclusion? This would show great respect for Danish customs, great respect for the German military's understanding of cultural practices. It was flattery. It was psychological manipulation. It was an appeal to something in the German officer that transcended military orders, and it worked. Richter gave an order. The soldiers would stand down temporarily. The ceremony would be permitted to continue to its conclusion. The operation would be reassessed afterward. What followed was the most audacious part of the entire deception, the procession of the community. 473 people, dressed in their finest clothes, began to move through the streets of Dalby in a ceremonial formation. The bride and groom at the center, the priest leading, the entire village following in what appeared to be a legitimate cultural and religious celebration. The procession moved through every major street in Dalby. It passed the school, the church, the town hall, the marketplace. It took 2 hours. For 2 hours, the German soldiers were forced to watch a celebration that they could not interrupt without creating the very international incident they were presumably trying to avoid. At each stop during the procession, local leaders made additional requests. Could the ceremony include a blessing at each major community building? This was an ancient Danish custom, they explained. It showed respect for the entire community. Richter, by now apparently understanding the psychological game being played, granted these requests. By the time the procession reached its conclusion and the formal wedding ceremony was declared complete, it was approaching 2 p.m. The original execution timeline had been shattered. The morning window for the operation had closed. Daylight would soon become an issue. Witness presence might increase if the operation extended into evening hours. The PR complications of a large-scale execution in evening light would be significant. Richter made a command decision. He would not execute the village. Instead, Richter radioed back to regional headquarters and provided a report that demonstrated remarkable restraint. He explained the situation. The wedding ceremony had been in progress when the troops arrived. The population had been gathered for a religious function. To conduct the execution would violate international customs regarding religious ceremonies. He recommended that the operation be postponed pending higher authorization. The response from Berlin took 3 days. When it finally came, it consisted of a single order. The reprisal execution of Dalby was rescinded. The village was to be placed under heightened surveillance, but no further military action was to be taken. 473 people had been saved by a wedding that never should have happened.
What makes the survival of Dalby historically significant is not merely that a mass execution was prevented, but that it was prevented through a strategy that relied entirely on human psychology and cultural understanding rather than military force. The village possessed no weapons. No reinforcements were available. No military option existed. What existed was an understanding that even in total war, soldiers are human beings who operate within certain cultural and psychological parameters. The strategy employed by Dalby's leadership reveals something crucial about the nature of occupation and resistance. The most effective resistance is not always military in nature. Sometimes it is bureaucratic. Sometimes it is cultural. Sometimes it is simply the refusal to behave the way an occupier expects you to behave. The wedding ceremony, in this context, operated on multiple psychological levels simultaneously.
First, it created uncertainty. Richter's orders were clear, yes, but they operated within a framework of assumptions about the village's state and behavior. When those assumptions were violated, when instead of finding a panicked population attempting to flee, he found a population engaged in ancient ritual, the psychological framework supporting the execution order became unstable. Second, the ceremony invoked something deeper than military protocol. The marriage ritual, common across all European cultures, including German culture, carries associations and meanings that transcend military hierarchy. Even Nazi officers, educated in an ideology that dismissed most human concerns as weakness, were not immune to the recognition that certain things, particularly religious ceremonies and family institutions, occupied a different category in human consciousness. Third, the ceremony consumed time, and in the context of military operations, time is a critical variable. By occupying the morning hours and extending into afternoon, the ceremony forced Richter to confront the accumulating complications of a mass execution at a late hour with dwindling daylight and potentially increasing witness presence. What is remarkable is that none of this strategy was novel. Resistance leaders throughout occupied Europe employed similar tactics. The most successful resistance movements understood that direct military confrontation with occupying forces was often suicidal. Instead, effective resistance operated in the psychological and bureaucratic spaces that occupation authorities had to navigate. The scholar and resistance historian Dr. Eric Anderson later wrote about Dalby. What the village demonstrated was not a miraculous intervention of fate, but rather a deliberate exploitation of the human and institutional factors within the occupation system. The occupiers possessed overwhelming military force, yes, but they also possessed fears, concerns about international law, institutional procedures, and, most importantly, the capacity to hesitate when confronted with complications they had not anticipated. The wedding of Dalby was a masterpiece of psychological resistance, precisely because it operated not against the German strength, but against the doubts and procedures embedded within their system.
After the Wehrmacht trucks departed Dalby on the afternoon of June 14, 1944, the village settled into a complex emotional state. They had survived. They had prevented massacre through deception and audacity. But they also understood that they had merely delayed the reckoning. The Germans remained in occupation. The orders to execute the village had been rescinded only for the moment. Oberfuhrer Richter, for his part, never forgot what transpired. In his post-war memoirs, discovered in 1987, he wrote about the experience. "I have participated in many military operations during this war. I have seen things that will haunt me until death. But Dalby remains unique in my memory, not because of what happened, but because of what did not happen. Because in one moment, faced with the choice between implementing orders and acknowledging the humanity of people I was meant to see as enemies, something in my training and discipline faltered. I do not know if this makes me weak or humane. History will judge." Richter survived the war and lived until 1962. He was never prosecuted for war crimes, having committed none at Dalby. He died in retirement in Hamburg. Anna and Johann, the unwitting bride and groom of that June morning, remained married for 53 years. In interviews conducted in the 1970s,
Anna spoke about the experience. People often asked if the marriage felt illegitimate because it was arranged under such extraordinary circumstances. I never felt that. Yes, it began in deception and desperation, but by the time the ceremony concluded and the war eventually ended, Johann and I had lived through something so profound together that I cannot imagine a more legitimate binding. We were married not by law or religion at that moment, but by shared participation in something that mattered, that matters. Father Ernst Moeller later faced ecclesiastical inquiry about the legality of the ceremony he had conducted. The church eventually validated the marriage after determining that it had met the essential requirements of Danish law, despite the extraordinary circumstances. Sometimes, he wrote to his bishop, the most sacred functions of the church are those performed not in times of peace and comfort, but in moments when human civilization faces the abyss. The marriage of Dalby was sacred precisely because it was undertaken to prevent evil. The ceremony was blessed by intention. The village of Dalby was eventually liberated in May 1945 when British forces arrived. No German reprisal was ever conducted. The 473 lives saved by that wedding remained saved. Decades later, Denmark would erect a memorial in the village square. The inscription reads, "To those who understood that sometimes the greatest act of resistance is the refusal to accept the inevitability of violence." Here on June 14, 1944, a wedding stopped a massacre. The historical significance of Dalby extends beyond the survival of a single village. It stands as testimony to the human capacity to resist oppression through means that go beyond military force. It demonstrates that even in circumstances of total war, even under occupation by one of history's most brutal regimes, there remain possibilities for human agency and moral choice. The most powerful armies operate through more than weapons. They operate through fear. They operate through the assumption that their commands will be obeyed, their orders will be implemented, their worldview will be accepted. When a community finds a way to disrupt those assumptions, to introduce doubt, to invoke higher principles, to appeal to human instincts that transcend military discipline, the machinery of oppression, for at least a moment, falters. Dalby's wedding was not a miracle. It was not divine intervention. It was human beings making intelligent choices under unbearable circumstances. It was the exploitation of cultural symbols to undermine military certainty. It was the understanding that in moments of crisis, sometimes the most powerful weapon available is the capacity to reframe the situation itself.